I believe. Okay, we're going to be starting. It's on the first page, and verses 3 and 4 is where we're going to begin. So, guys, we'll be starting there when you get back, or before you get back. Let me go ahead and start in verse 1, because it's kind of like Paul has this really great run-on sentence going here, and I just don't want to interrupt it. So, I'm going to read verses 1 through 4 in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. Therefore, when we could endure it no longer, we thought it best to be left behind in Athens alone. And we sent Timothy, our brother and God's fellow worker in the gospel of Christ, to strengthen and encourage you as to your faith, so that no man may be disturbed by these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we have been destined for this. For indeed, when we were with you, we kept telling you in advance that we were going to suffer affliction, and so it came to pass, as you know. Okay, so we've been talking about ways that Paul encourages. He encourages by letter. He encourages by sending brethren to go and find out how the family's doing so they can be encouraged by that as well. Well, another way we can encourage and strengthen faith of spiritually young believers is to share with them how God has told us about things in the future. What you see there in those two Old Testament passages, as well as John chapter 13, is for the New Testament, is God does reveal to us. I mean, we have, you'll see just in the middle part of that paragraph, I'll just read it now. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12, it says, "Indeed, all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." And so when we are seeking to glorify God and to please Him, and all of a sudden this really bad things, whether it's people at work or other situations, all these sorts of things that can happen, and you say, I'm trying to live my life to glorify God, and all this sort of stuff happens. What God says is, yes, I told you, that's what will happen. Now God, of course, is not the one who's persecuting them. When Satan sees God's people being revived, as this congregation is, Satan is going to do what he can to stomp that fire out. He wants to keep the people quiet, comfortable, and satisfied. God doesn't want us to be any of those things. Now, He does call for us, as we're going to see at the end of this chapter, to live quiet lives. But the thing is that we need to understand, yes, our lives need to be quiet, but we don't need to be quiet when it comes to sharing the good news of Jesus with other people. We need to be out there. And Satan does not like us to be that way. So, Paul shared with believers that things would occur in his own future. Remember in Acts chapter 20 and verse 25, where he was talking with those elders from Ephesus, and he told them that he knew he was going to go to Jerusalem, and that persecutions and afflictions awaited for him there. He tells them that in their own situation, there's the 2 Timothy passage, that we also will encounter persecution. So he reminds these brethren they need not be disturbed by these afflictions. Now, Paul there is talking about his own afflictions, since he had already warned them that these things would transpire, and so it came to pass. So he says, you know that we are bound for afflictions. That's Paul, Timothy, Titus, the whole entourage that's there with him. He says, you know that's going to happen, and so it has. So that's actually, he's trying to help them see, this is a good thing. We're not taken by surprise by when Satan does things. Now, his timing may not be anticipated, but the fact that it happens should be. When things start to happen like that, let us not be surprised. We may not want it to happen at the time, but I'm not exactly sure there's a time when I would say, well, I can't wait to have affliction. I wish it'd come sooner rather than later. Well, not necessarily, but we know that it shall happen. And so, when trials like these happen in their midst, they will know that God has not abandoned them. He has told them, and really, what did Jesus say at the end of the Great Commission there in Matthew chapter 28? And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. So we're not handling these things by ourselves. Our Lord is with us. Remember the thing on the the road to Damascus, we've talked about this before, how when God shone the light on Saul of Tarsus, that he let Saul know that he took it very personally what Saul was doing. Because what was it that Jesus said to Saul?
Why are you persecuting me?
Yes, he didn't say, why are you persecuting my people? He didn't say that. Why are you persecuting the apostles? Didn't say that. He says, why are you persecuting me? And so God takes it very personally. When somebody's doing something wrong to you, this is one of the reasons why maybe we should be praying for those who persecute you, because God may do something. And see, you might be able to say, Lord, I know that you want these people in heaven with you. So, Father, in their, how was it put by that minor prophet? He says, in hardship, remember mercy. Or I think it's in hardship, remember mercy, or remember compassion. So be gentle with them. What thoughts, questions, or comments do you have about that little paragraph there, verses 3 and 4?
So Timothy goes by direction of Paul, because they say, when we could take it no longer, meaning the afflictions and the suffering. So now he sends a younger person who may be more substantially able to undergo, because he's trying to strengthen the people there. Is he doing the same thing that Paul would be doing while he was there?
I think so, because I don't think this is Timothy's first foray out into being sent to various places, because remember, Paul was grooming Timothy to take over. I think the reason, Larry, is that Paul knew that if he was there, then he would have become the issue, and things could have been stirred up just because he's back. That one that was here before, he has returned, and I think Paul didn't want to do that to that church. And so he sent somebody that perhaps was less well known than himself, so that he could do the job that needed to be done without becoming the issue. How some people just like to be the issue. Paul didn't want to be the issue. He wanted Jesus to be the issue, but he didn't want to become the focus. Some people always need to be seen. Paul wasn't that person.
Makes sense.
Other thoughts?
How does tradition tell us that Timothy was martyred? Do you know?
It's odd that you would say how, not if. Because I know that he was, but I don't know, I don't remember right now. And I've mentioned this book before, and I was looking for it several weeks back, and I couldn't find it in our library, so somebody must have checked it out or something. It's called Fox's Book of Martyrs. You'd probably be able to find one of those in most used bookstores, because they must have sold a jillion of those things. But it talks about all the martyrs of Christianity from the apostles all the way, and I don't remember where it stops, but it goes quite a ways with them, and mentions how Matthew was speared in Pakistan, and somebody else had this happen, and all these sorts of things. And so it's kind of interesting what our early brothers and sisters went through. There's you can I'm trying to remember if it's Tacitus. Tacitus, I believe, now I may have his name wrong here, but I believe he was the governor of one of the provinces in just below the Black Sea, like Bithynia or Cappadocia or something. And he would write letters to Caesar to say, how do I handle these particular things? And so he would write, I think it was really sucking up was the whole deal. But he would write, and he would talk about these Christians and what they would do. And the problem that he had with them is they were a very obstinate people, because they could put them in all these various tortures he would describe and do all these things, but they would not recant. It was interesting because he says those who are truly Christians will not recant, although some have been made to. So he considered the Christians are the ones who would hold steadfastly, and the ones who said, oh, no, I'll pray to Zeus or Caesar or whatever they need them to do. And he'd say, the ones that are truly Christians, they won't do that. They had a thing back then, and maybe we've talked about this, and so if this is becoming redundant, then say, we know, we heard it, thank you. But the ones that did not recant, there's a name that was given to them. They were called confessors, because they would confess Jesus as Lord. They would not confess Caesar as Lord. And so they went through all the sort of things. For instance, there was a one by the name of Origen. Origen, he was placed on put on the rack. Now you know what the rack is, right? They tie your hands and they tie your feet with these ropes, and then they stretch you, and so pulls your shoulders out of socket, pulls your hips out of joint, and I mean it's rather painful sort of things. But he went through that, and then would arise a Caesar, because for the first 4 centuries, you had Caesars that were bad, persecuting Christians, and there are Caesars that were not so bad. They didn't do that sort of thing. Now each one of the Caesars was considered, since Augustus was considered a god, but most of the Caesars did not accept that sort of a title. They didn't expect people to worship them, unless you had Caesars like the 4th Caesar by the name of Caligula, or the 5th Caesar by the name of Nero, or the Domitian, was he the 10th Caesar? Domitian was the first Caesar that demanded empire-wide persecution against Christians. Nero, he just desired there to be persecution of Christians in and around the environs of Rome. He was the one, however, that would tie Christians to stakes in his garden, and then wrap them in cloths that had been doused in flammable liquid, and they'd light them up so that they could give light to his garden parties.
Candles.
Yeah, there were candles, human candles. I mean, terrible sorts of things that our brethren had to endure, today. Oh, you're one of those Jesus freaks? Oh, stop, no. We're so afraid of we say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. I've never met too many people that's not true. Words bother them. They get hurt or quieted or silenced and cowed into fear because if somebody calls them a name, one of those religious wackos. Oh, I'm not a religious wacko. So, anyhow, but Tatian, I think it was, would write these things, and he talked about these. I mean, it's very specific. Tonight, what we'll do is, I'll try to remember. Daryl, you can remind me, or somebody else remind me when it gets to be 7:30. We'll take a 5-minute break at 7:30, and I'll go look on mine and see if I can find.
I'll set the timer.
You just don't want to take any chances, do you? Brethren, Larry Paul has the answer. When you hear the noise, make your break. Okay, verse 5. Verse 5 reads this way. For this reason, when I could endure it no longer. No, this is the second time. Remember verse 1, he said, I could endure it no longer. Now again, when I could endure it no longer, I also, because verse 1, he said, we, verses 1 into verses 2, we this, we that, we the other. But verse 5, when I could endure it no longer, I also sent to find out about your faith, for fear that the tempter might have tempted you, and our labor should be in vain. So when Peter here is speaking of Satan, he calls him your adversary. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, it says, behold, be a sober spirit, be on the alert, your adversary, the devil, prowls about like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Thus, Satan opposes us personally. He opposes, God is for us personally. In each individual person, God has a very special feeling for that particular person. Well, Satan does too. It's a different feeling, but he also opposes us personally. Now in this verse, Paul points out that Satan also opposes us spiritually, for he sent Timothy to find out about your faith for fear the tempter might have tempted you. So he's after, Satan will try to mess with them physically, as we see him doing on a number of occasions, and also spiritually. In conversations with non-believers, it's not unusual for them to question us about whether we believe in the devil. As they might also say, do you believe in angels? Do you believe in demons? Questions us about those things, all spiritual beings. A mode of argument I follow, so this is what I do with that, is to adopt a courtroom model. In a courtroom, the legitimacy of a verdict depends upon the evidence. So I ask, which is more reasonable type questions? When you're asked by them something, well, let me ask you a question. What's more reasonable to think? Now, I messed up with these pages here because normally I do most of my notes front and back of a page so that I save whatever it cost, a penny or something. Scottish heritage. But I did that with yours also. So I apologize for doing that if that really messes you up. Okay, for example, which is more reasonable? To believe that in the beginning there was nothing, which then exploded and gave us a universe of tremendous diversity and complexity? When somebody says, do you believe in the Big Bang? Well, let me see. If there was an explosion in a printing factory, would you expect them to be able to piece through the rubble and see how all that chaos and everything that happened, that all of a sudden it was just like you pulled away some of the ash and you saw there was a dictionary that had never been there before, and it was put together. There was no misspellings. It was alphabetically done, nouns, verbs. It told us all the etymological description, where it came from. Would you believe that would happen if there was an explosion in a printing factory? Then why could you ever believe that there could be such sophistication, such simplicity, such complexity, all the things that make up this universe? Could you believe that would happen if there was a huge explosion? I mean, is that reasonable to believe that?
No.
I mean, for me, that's not reasonable. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's a whole lot easier to believe because this shows there is a infinite mind at work. It's not chaos. An explosion is chaos. Chaos doesn't work towards any sort of order, but God did. So I asked that question. Or, which is more reasonable? To believe a being of infinite power and knowledge who exists outside of time created the heavens and the earth? And after several of these types of questions, I will then say, so if Jesus believed in the devil, anybody have a problem with the fact I said Jesus believes in the devil? No, because he created him too. So if Jesus believed in the devil and even spoke with him, then I will also believe that the devil exists. I just think that just makes a lot more sense to say. Now, of course, if they say, well, if it's in the Bible, I won't believe it. You can really nail them on that one too, because there's a lot of things that are in the Bible that they do believe. They do believe. However, this verse, that's verse 5, does show that while by the charge Paul gave to Timothy, he hoped for the best. But because of what he writes in verse 5, he fears the worst. It must have been a terrible time for Paul to wait for Timothy's return, for if his fears were founded, then all the time, love and energy that he and his entourage put into Thessalonica would have been for nothing. If they went back and there was no longer a church there, the Christians that Timothy found on the streets, and he says, hey, it's so good to see you. He says, no, don't bother me. Your Jesus was not there for us when we needed him, so we've gone back to whatever. So that must have been a difficult time for the Apostle Paul. Remember in another book, not Thessalonians, but in another book, Paul talks to the Corinthians, and he says, and in addition to all this is the daily pressure for all the churches upon me. Paul felt the weight of all the needs of all the congregations. The church in Rome that was struggling with the Jew-Gentile issue, the church in Corinth that was struggling with every issue, all the various problems that they were facing. Paul, I'm sure that it was probably when we get over to chapter 5 and verse 17 of this book where he says, pray without ceasing. That was probably something that he did a lot of. I mean, that was probably what he did. because there was no way that he could have been in all those places that he felt the need to be, but he knew one who could be in all those places. And so he prayed to him to take care of those brothers and sisters. So, thoughts, questions, or comments?
You know, you wonder because this one church was so strong, but think of how many people he must have talked to even get this one church. Because haven't you ever had anyone that you've been dealing with for years? I had a girl that stayed with me for 10 years, and then another couple, they didn't have anywhere their dogs go, so they came and lived with us for a while. They always went to church, but they went away from it as years went by, and they got older, and they got old enough to be out on their own. They stayed for a while, and then they too went. So how many people? So he must have been very worried about these people.
So some of the things, however, this is part of his mission strategy, is why it worked in the case of this group, as well as in others too. He would enter a city and he would go to a synagogue. Why do you think he would go to a synagogue?
Well, they were believers in God. And
that's very good.
They had already heard that Messiah was coming.
Okay.
So they had the background.
Okay. They also had a authority that they followed. It wasn't the leader of the synagogue, but the authority was the Word of God.
Yes.
And so he could show them, as you know, when we read.
And it progressed until Jesus came. And he had to just show them where Jesus had come.
Exactly right. And so that's why when we look at Acts chapter 17 there around verses 2 and 3, where it says how he would reason with them from the scriptures. And so he wasn't there for very long at all. But you see, the people that were there, they already had a mind. In fact, he talks about there was a great number of Jews as well as a number of the leading women. I mean, not Jews, but Gentiles there. So these Gentiles also, they were proselytes. They were students of Judaism. They were thinking about converting to Judaism. But now Paul brings this Judaism to life in the person of our Lord. And all of a sudden they're saying, this is what we've been wanting to hear.
Dynamic person.
Who, Paul? I would imagine.
Can you imagine?
I would imagine he was.
Yes.
Other thoughts, questions, or comments? See, Paul had a strategy. He went to people that would probably give him a hearing. However, he went to those who he wasn't sure of. When he went to Athens, and they brought him to Mars Hill, the Areopagus there, he was really looking forward to being in Athens. You've heard me say this before. Athens was his goal. Rome was not the goal. Rome, he said, I'm going to visit Rome on my way to Spain, or Tarshish is what he says, but that's Spain. He says, so, if I have time, I'll stop in Rome. But it was just kind of a stop in, kind of a drop by. But Athens, he wanted to go to Athens because he knew those guys were the intellectuals, the thinkers, the philosophers, and he had a philosophy that would just blow them away. But when he talked about the resurrection, he said, what would this idle babbler say? Sad.
Was it one of them who said he found Paul to be a pestilent fellow?
Yeah. Yep. Okay, verse 6. Verse 6 says, but now that Timothy has come to us from you and has brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always think kindly of us, longing to see us, just as we also long to see you. Well, let's just stop right there, since I did. You can almost hear an audible sigh of relief coming from Paul as he writes this verse. It's a great big, oh, thank you, Lord. Paul had sent him to find out about the Thessalonians' faith. Yet what is so wonderful is that Timothy also brings word as to their love. Not just faith, but also their love. So not only had their confidence in God been severely tested and had successfully passed the test, but they had also maintained the right type of Christian conduct towards each other and those around them. This is just how Paul says that our love should be. The only thing that means anything is faith working in love. That's what he says. That's what means something. Faith working in love. Galatians 5 and verse 6. It is therefore unsurprising that these brethren would welcome a return visit from Paul whenever it would be possible. And of course, I'm sure that Paul would say, maybe taking a little trip there, showing up, late in the evening just before the gates close, and I can scurry into some house or something. Yeah, but he didn't want to take the chance on that one. We don't know about Paul ever returning to Thessalonica. Isn't that kind of sad? I mean, I know his love for those brethren. He would have loved to have gone, and clearly, as Timothy just told them, they would have loved for him to be there also. But we don't know that Paul ever returned to Thessalonica. Okay, then verse 7. For this reason, brethren, in all our distress and affliction, we were comforted about you through your faith. Whereas Paul and his companions continued to experience distress and affliction, they were overjoyed to hear the wonderful news from Thessalonica. Don't ever be afraid to share any good news of how God is blessing you, for while we may fear that it will hurt those who are similarly blessed, the opposite is true. It encourages others to hear how God's people are being blessed. I think that's so true. When you hear how you might be going through a difficult time, but when you hear about the blessings that God is bestowing on others, are you jealous or are you grateful? Maybe nobody likes to go through difficult times, whether it's health situations, relationship situations, financial. Nobody wants to go through that. But if you can hear how other people are being blessed, can we be grateful for the grace and mercy God is showing them? Can we recognize in that God is still out there? He is still loving His people. He is still showing compassion. I mean, can we be those people? Or do we get upset because they're getting good stuff and why not me?
I hope not.
Well, I would like to hope not too. But see, well,
It would be easy.
it might be, but it would be unfortunate. I would much, rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Let me ask you this question, knowing already the answer. Which do you find it easier? To rejoice with those who rejoice or to weep with those who weep? Rejoice? You find that to be easier? Well, good. Because almost every other time I've ever asked that question, people say, well, I find it easier to weep with those who weep, to be there for them at that particular time and things of that nature. And sadly, there's that little part of my brain saying, and you're thinking, oh, I'm so glad it's not me. I'm so glad it's not me. But rejoice with those who rejoice. People find that to be difficult because they feel that, well, that's not fair. God is showing partiality here. Those people are being blessed. I'm not being blessed. Why can't I be blessed? They're being blessed. Okay. Other thoughts? Verse 8. Verse 8 reads, for now we really live. See, he said, we're comforted about you through your faith. For now we really live if you stand firm in the Lord. This reinforces Paul's relief because of their faithfulness. For Paul, as with Jesus, what is important is not what is happening on our outsides. All the things that are happening on the outside, that's not what's important. What is truly important is what is happening within ourselves. I'll go ahead and read that 2 Corinthians passage. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. That's the passage that talks about for momentary light affliction. You know the one? 2 Corinthians 4, 16 through 18 says, therefore we do not lose heart. But though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. Now what he's saying is that the glory that we're going to be receiving won't even be able to be compared with the suffering, the adversity, the heartache, all those kinds of things of this life. He says when we get there, there's not going to be a comparison. I mean, the things of this earth will grow strangely dim. If you remember the song, as we look on his glorious face. For while we look, not at the things which are seen, but the things that are not seen. Because the things that are seen are temporal, they're temporary. But the things that are not seen are eternal. See, those are the things that are going to last. The things that you can see should not have any genuine effect on us, because nothing that you can see is going to last. Even if it's your own flesh, it's not going to last. You are going to last through eternity. God is going to last through eternity. Heaven is going to last through eternity. Angels and demons in hell are going to last through eternity. Those are the things that should be important to us. That's what should be important. The outer things, those things, I mean, the day you were born, the clock, it's kind of like those, you ever seen those guys play, I don't remember what the name of it is, but chess in the parks where they have those timers, and they hit those things, they move a guy, they do that sort of thing. Well, the day you were born, God pushed the button, and you started dying. Every day you lived was one less day that you had. One day you're closer to your death. Remember, we've got that appointment, according to Hebrews 9 and verse 27. It's appointed on a man once to die, and then comes the judgment. So each one of us has an appointment. There's an appointed time for every event under heaven. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes, a time to be born and a time to die. And so it's going to happen. So the thing is that don't allow the distractions of life, all the things of this sphere of existence. This is not real. It's not going to last. It's here now. I mean, it's real. There's really a piece of lucite here that I'm hitting, but that's not eternal lucite. That's not going to last forever. The things that last for eternity, those are the things that are important. Those are things that should be our focus. We should be more concerned about those things. Chris and I have the 200-year rule that we follow. If something is not going to matter 200 years from now, then we don't allow it to matter to us today. I mean, we'll deal with it, but we're not going to be absorbed in it. Paul was absorbed in the spiritual welfare of these brethren. He wasn't concerned about their physical welfare as much as he was their spiritual welfare. Although knowing these were young Christians. And so maybe if the persecution got so severe, maybe they would become one of those who would recant their faith. Maybe they would be the ones who would return to the idols from the living and true God. That might have been true for them. And so the physical does have something of an effect, but it's only if it has an effect on our spirit, the spiritual realm, our spiritual lives. Then it's something to be concerned with. Thoughts? Questions? Anyone want to argue that point with me? Oh, come on. Yes, sir.
We know that all physical things will end the day of judgment.
That's true.
Only the spiritual will exist from that point on.
You're right. Flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom of God. And so that's true. Are you all keep looking at your clock to see if 7:30 is coming soon? I know. Don't worry.
I got that taken care of.
We got it. By my clock, it's 10 minutes from now. So let's.
Rick, that and I believe wholeheartedly what you're saying. I'm not contesting anything you're saying, but we do. Our attention span is, that's why we do the Lord's Supper every first day of the week, and we should be thinking about that every day. But we are so apt to forget. Somebody cuts you off in the lane, somebody takes your parking spot that you've been waiting for, somebody doesn't speak to you, the trivialness of how people behave on things that are so small, and they make it no small matter at all. And so even though we know this to be true, they don't live that way. And we have to be cautious that we're not caught up in that fervor, because we have a very tempestuous winds blowing.
Oh my, yes.
Easily be caught up in that.
Oh my, yes. Recently, a member of the congregation here had a relative with them, and after worship, the relative asked if they could be taken home. They didn't want to stick around for Bible class, and so in the car, certainly the person said, "Well, what did you think of our worship? The singing, the Lord's Supper. What did you think?" And the person, was complimentary. There was, no rancor or anything of that nature in that regards. But then, when they were getting out of the car, the wind happened to catch the door and bump it into them. And this particular member said to me, "Boy, you would not believe the words that came out of that mouth." And it's funny because he looked at the relative and said, "Really? We've only left worship about 20 minutes ago, really?" So sometimes, the things of this life, they do have a way of trying to get our attention. Okay, verse 8. For now, already there. Okay, so we read that. Yet this is not an admonition, but also an observation. For the phrase, "if you stand firm in the Lord." Now, whenever we see an "if," we think that it's somewhat of a question that's being asked. Yet this is not for the phrase, "if you stand firm in the Lord," is called a first-class conditional sentence. In other words, it assumes that the premise is true for the sake of argument. When else have you heard something like that asked or something like that said, a first-class conditional sentence?
If you be the Son of God.
Bingo. Yes, Matthew chapter 4. Satan, Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness in order to be tempted by the devil, and he had nothing to eat or drink for 40 days. And at the end of that time, he became hungry, and the devil came up and said, "If you are the Son of God, turn those stones and make them into bread." Now, only reason why I had this in here was because of what Larry reminded us that was said by Satan at that particular point. It wasn't that Satan did not know that Jesus was the Son of God. That wasn't it. He did know. But the way the sentence is written, we're expected to also know. You don't have to memorize the thing, first-class conditional sentence. It's not going to be on the test. Just realize that you can insert the word "since" and have the meaning become more clear for us today in our mindset, the way our minds think. Since you're the Son of God, turn these stones and make them into bread. Now see, doesn't that make more sense to you, that knowing that Satan knew that was actually the Son of God standing there? So if anybody ever tries to tell you that it must have been a great disguise that Jesus had because Satan didn't even know it was who he was. No, that's not it at all. So, this is just like what Satan said to Jesus in the wilderness, "If you're the Son of God." Satan knew exactly who Jesus was. He was not questioning his deity. Rather, he was saying, as a first-class conditional sentence does, "Since you are the Son of God." So, that's what's going on here, and that's in verse 8. Now we can really live. Since you stand firm in the Lord. Since you stand firm, we can now live. See, Paul's not saying, I really hope that you are. If you aren't, that's not it at all. Paul understands these people truly are faithful. Timothy has brought such wonderful news to Paul. He says, now, boy, we can live. We can take a deep breath and praise God. Thoughts?
What was that Satan said to Eve regarding the fruit in the garden?
He said,
Kind of a statement?
well, he just added one word to what God actually said. God told him in Genesis 2:17 that the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. And so Satan said to Eve, has God said that you can eat of any tree in the garden? Oh, sure, of every tree in the garden we may freely eat, but not the tree in the middle of the garden. for the day that we eat of that or even touch it, we shall surely die. Satan said, you shall not surely die. It's the same sort of thing that we hear, sadly, people being taught in denominational churches when they read Mark chapter 16 and verse 16, and they read it to say, he who has believed and has not been baptized shall be saved. You know, that's the way they read it. That's not what it says. They won't say that it says that, but that's what they believe, because they don't believe you need to be baptized in order to be saved.
I wonder how much insight God allows Satan to have in our minds, just like Job. You know? He was picking Job's mind there to some level.
I think Satan was an incredible student of human nature. I think when he was very observant at this final creation of God's, you know, this human being. And you know, it wasn't like the second day when he showed up in the garden. I think he was looking for a while, and now he's had, you know, how many years? You know, 10,000 years to observe humanity. I think, you know, Satan would have made a wonderful counselor, because he's an observer of the human condition. And so I think Satan just knows the way that people think. He knows the buttons that most people have. I mean, we've already been warned. You know, in 1 John chapter 2 and verse 15 and following, you know, for all that is in the world, do not love the world or things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, boastful pride of life, these things are of the world. But the world's passing away and its lust thereof. But the one who does the will of God abides forever. But those three, that's what he you know, those are the big arrows that he has in his quiver. But his arrows are like a MIRV ICBM. You know what MIRV? I don't mean like Merv Griffin. Merv Griffin gave us Jeopardy and Wheel of Fortune. Did you know that? He was also considered, his hometown was my place of birth. No. San Mateo. Look it up. San Mateo, home of Merv Griffin. That's about as close as I ever get to greatness, you know. Do you know what this stands for? Okay. Multiple independently guided reentry vehicles. This is where they shoot one ICBM up into the air, and then as it's gone, you know, into space, and then starts its downward trajectory, then what happens is the front of it, capsule, it opens up, and then they have all these littler nuclear missiles. You know, this one's coming down, and then at some point in its downward trajectory, you get all those that are going to do that sort of a thing. Every single one of those is a smaller nuclear weapon. So they don't just send one missile and you knock out one missile. You've got to get this thing before it reaches this point. And see, this is why, you know, now they're concerned about all these hypersonic missiles that are able to also, you know, do the move sort of thing like this. And so, yeah, they're able to evade anti-missile systems. And so someday somebody's going to push a button, perhaps, and that'll just be a terrible situation. But anyhow, Satan has lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, the boastful pride of life. Those are the biggies. That's this. But then lust of the flesh, well, let's see. That would include gluttony. That would include let me just finish this one sentence and then you go and do whatever. Fornication, it can include drugs. Okay, stop that thing. Okay. Yeah. So these also are things that impact people's lives because it pleases flesh. It pleases flesh. But then there's also the lust of the eyes. And so then you have things that do that sort of thing. The person who needs to get the bigger car, the bigger house, the bigger office, all that sort of stuff. The boastful pride of life, this job, that job, the other job, or any number of so many other things. Satan will use all those various things because these are MERV, these multiple independently guided reentry vehicles. That's what those things are. But it's lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, and the boastful pride of life. So think about that. We'll talk about it a little bit when we get back. So you got a few minutes that you can do whatever you want.